She saw a man asleep at his desk. She did not ask a single question. She walked across the operations floor in front of 60 engineers, called out his name, and told security to collect his badge before he had finished lifting his head. Marcus Hale had been awake for 72 hours. He had not slept because he was lazy. He had not slept because he was careless. He had not slept because he was the only person standing between Vertex Pay and a coordinated cyberattack that was 48 minutes from completion. None of that mattered to Diane Cole on her first morning as CEO. Not yet. Welcome, and if this is your first time here, hit subscribe before we get into this. You are going to want to be here for the end. Vertex Pay was not the kind of company that could afford slow mornings. It processed corporate wire transfers, payment authentication, and high-volume transaction routing for over 4,000 clients across North America. Every second of downtime carried a price tag that ran into the tens of millions. The infrastructure was not just the backbone of the company. It was the company. Everything else, the brand, the offices, the leadership titles, was decoration built around the machine. Marcus Hale understood the machine the way only years of intimate, unglamorous contact produces. He was 36 years old, quiet in the particular way of someone who had stopped needing to announce himself, always slightly rumpled, always with a cold coffee somewhere near his keyboard that he had forgotten to drink. New people assumed he was unremarkable. The ones who had worked alongside him for any length of time held a different understanding. Marcus knew where every load-bearing wall in the system was, including the ones that had been built by people who had left the company 5 years ago and documented nothing. He was also the sole parent of a 9-year-old named Theo who had his father's eyes and a habit of asking questions that landed harder than intended. Marcus had built his entire life around 2 fixed points, keeping Theo stable and keeping his job. He did not socialize inside the company. He did not cultivate sponsors or mentors or internal advocates. He showed up. He worked. He went home. That was the shape of his life. Diane Cole was 31 years old and had just been appointed CEO of Vertex Pay after the founder stepped back for medical reasons. She was legitimately sharp, credentialed, driven, and aware that every person in the building was waiting to see whether she had earned the role or inherited it. That awareness lived in everything she did. She made decisions fast. She despised visible weakness. She had spent years proving herself in rooms where people expected her to fail, and the habit of overcorrection had become so natural she could no longer see it. She arrived on the operations floor at 7:42 on her first morning, wanting to see the company without the performance her department heads would have prepared for a formal tour. She was going to see the real thing. She saw Marcus. His head was down on his forearms. The monitors around him were alive with scrolling amber alerts and cascading log output. She did not read the screens. She looked at the badge holder on the desk, read the name, and spoke. Marcus Hale. He jolted upright. His eyes were unfocused. He had the particular disorientation of a person who has been awake so long that the boundary between sleep and consciousness had dissolved. Ms. Cole, he said immediately, you need to hear what's happening to the core authentication layer before anyone touches. I've already seen everything I need to see, Diane said. Security, collect his badge. HR, initiate termination immediately. Please, he said it simply, without desperation. 5 minutes. If someone restarts the primary cluster before I brief you, we are going to lose. We are done here. The room did not move. 40 engineers who had watched Marcus work through the night, who had seen him change his shirt in the bathroom at 2 a.m., who had watched him rebuild defensive architecture by hand on a live system for 3 days, said nothing. Not one of them spoke. The professional cost of contradicting a new CEO in her first hour was a calculation none of them were willing to make. Marcus stood. He did not raise his voice. He removed his badge without argument and set it on the desk with the particular quietness of a man who has spent his life working without recognition and has made a kind of peace with it. Before he walked away, he found a junior engineer named Petra in the line of faces watching him and said 4 words clearly enough that several people heard them. Do not restart it. Then he walked out of the building, and no one stopped him. The next 4 hours looked normal. That was the problem. The dashboards showed a manageable picture. Queue times were stable. Transaction routing was clean. Diane moved through her first round of department briefings with focused energy, outlining expectations, describing the cultural shift she intended to drive, using words like accountability and transformation. Some people in those meetings felt energized. Others left with something they couldn't name pressing at the edges of their thoughts. Nobody knew enough to name it, because the thing holding the system together was not visible. It was a set of manually constructed isolation barriers, temporary logic layers, and hand-patched authentication reroutes that Marcus had built over 72 sleepless hours. From the outside, the machine looked like it was running. It was running. It was running because of work that was now walking home in the cold. What the team did not know, what Marcus had been trying to explain when Diane cut him off, was the trigger. 3 days earlier, Marcus had identified a dormant activation mechanism embedded deep in the primary processing cluster. It was not a bug, it was a weapon. Someone had been inside the system for over a week, moving slowly, learning the architecture, building a hidden pathway toward the high-value transaction queues. The mechanism they had left behind was elegant and specific. It would remain completely invisible under normal conditions, but if anyone performed a standard system restart, it would fire. Every temporary defensive layer Marcus had built would collapse in the exact moment the restart cleared the memory state they were running on, and the attack would enter its active phase. Marcus had written all of this down, a full file, time-stamped log summaries, patch annotations, explicit warnings. He had planned to deliver it to executive leadership first thing that morning. He had been terminated before he could say a single complete sentence. At 11:54, the primary processing cluster began showing elevated latency. Transactions that should have cleared in milliseconds were taking 4 and 5 seconds. The on-duty supervisor recognized the pattern immediately: memory accumulation. He had cleared it this way dozens of times. A clean restart would fix it in 30 seconds. Petra was standing 3 feet away when the supervisor reached for the command input. "He told us not to restart it," she said, quietly, almost to herself. The supervisor looked at her. "He's been terminated." He executed the restart at 11:59. At home, Marcus was lying on the sofa in the same clothes he had left the building in. His jacket was still on. One shoe was off. The other was still laced. His laptop sat open beside him, lock screen cycling, because he had not had the energy to close it. He had poured a glass of water and forgotten to drink it. He had not made it to the bedroom. Theo was at the kitchen table doing homework when his father came through the door. Marcus had looked at him and almost smiled. That was the last thing he remembered. He did not hear his phone. The restart executed at 11:59. By 12:04, the first signs appeared. Authentication tokens went asynchronous. Transaction sessions began reporting state mismatches, payments showing as uninitialized, as though they had never begun. The token synchronization service lost its connection to the primary routing pathway in the exact moment the restart cleared the memory state where Marcus's temporary logic had been running. The isolation barriers collapsed. The trigger fired. By 12:11, outbound transaction routing was redirecting a subset of corporate transfers toward endpoints outside Vertex Pay's verified network. Reconciliation failed silently on a category of high-value transfers. 3 enterprise clients had payments suspended in a state that was neither completed nor cleanly reversible. If you've stayed this far, drop a comment right now. Tell me what you think Diane does next. I want to see your predictions. The operations floor became a different room, red across every board. Engineers moving with the tight, contained urgency of people who understand exactly how serious something is. The supervisor who had performed the restart stood at his console, breathing through his mouth, saying nothing. Petra had already pulled up Marcus's repository notes. She was reading them aloud to anyone close enough to hear, and what they described was the current failure mode in precise, specific detail, written by someone who had anticipated every step of this outcome and had been escorted from the building before he could explain it. Diane was called down from the executive floor. She walked into the operations center for the second time that day and stopped at the entrance. The monitors were overwhelmingly red. Engineers moved between stations with the specific body language of people managing a disaster. They do not have the full tools to stop. "Tell me what's happening," she said. A senior engineer named Rowan turned from his console. His face had the particular composure of someone who had decided to say the true thing and was not going to flinch from it. "It looks like Marcus had the system held together manually for 3 days. The restart cleared everything he built. We triggered exactly what he was trying to prevent." Diane did not move for a moment. "Can we reverse it?" "We are trying. The problem is that his patch logic wasn't formally documented. It was constructed live, under pressure, by someone who understood the legacy architecture in ways none of us fully share. We have his notes. We're working through them, but following someone else's live architecture rebuild in the middle of an active attack is—" Rowan stopped. He did not finish the sentence. "He did not need to." Diane asked where the CTO was. The CTO was available. The CTO understood the system's strategic architecture and was operationally thin in precisely the areas that mattered right now. She asked if anyone present had a complete working picture of Marcus's patch construction. Nobody did. They each had pieces. She moved to a workstation and opened his repository herself. The file was dense, written in the compressed shorthand of someone working at speed with no time to format anything for an outside reader, but the picture it built was clear enough. The attack, the trigger, the manual defensive layers, the 72 hours of sustained, unwitnessed work, and at the bottom of the final page, in a font slightly larger than everything around it, a line that had evidently been added last. "If I am no longer available, do not restart the core services under any circumstances. This is not a performance issue. This is a staged attack waiting to be triggered. Contact me directly." There was a phone number. Nobody had called it. Diane looked at that line for a long time. She looked at the timestamp on the file. She thought about the moment in the operations center that morning, his face coming up from the desk, the specific quality of urgency in his voice before she cut across him, the way he had looked at her not with fear or desperation, but with the expression of someone watching a preventable disaster approach and being denied the space to prevent it. She had not misread him as unimportant. She had not read him at all. She had looked at the image and decided she already understood it, and she had been so certain she was right that the possibility of being wrong had not registered as a thing that could happen. She called his number 3 times, no answer. She asked HR for his home address, got into her car, and drove. The building was quiet and ordinary, the kind of neighborhood where people actually lived. Diane stood outside her car for a moment before walking to the door. She knocked, nothing. She knocked again. She was reaching for her phone when the door opened and a boy stood in the frame. 9 years old, dark eyes identical to his father's. He was holding a soccer cleat by its laces and looking at her with the evaluative calm of a child who had learned to read unfamiliar adults quickly. "Are you from my dad's work?" he asked. Diane did not answer immediately. She had not known there was a child. It had not appeared in any context in which Marcus existed at Vertex Pay because Marcus had never used his personal life as professional currency. "Yes," she said. "Is he home?" Theo opened the door wider. "He's asleep. He said something really bad was happening at work and he'd rest after he fixed it. He said it simply, the way children report facts. He hasn't really slept in a long time." The words moved through Diane in a way she did not have an immediate category for. Theo led her through a clean, economically arranged apartment, books stacked neatly, Theo's drawings covering the refrigerator, a child's world organized by a single parent who paid careful attention to what mattered. On the sofa, Marcus lay on his side in his jacket, one shoe on, the laptop open beside him with the lock screen cycling. A glass of water sat untouched on the table. He had the absolute stillness of a person whose body had simply stopped. "He promised he'd be back in time for dinner," Theo said quietly. "He always keeps that one." Diane looked at the apartment, at the laptop with its remote monitoring interface still up on the locked screen, at the jacket he hadn't had the energy to take off, at the water he'd poured and never drunk. She thought about the cultural reset speech she had given that morning, the language she had used about accountability and visible discipline, the certainty with which she had read the scene in the operations center and decided she understood it. She had walked into a room, looked at a man who had been holding the company together for 3 days without sleep, and fired him in front of his colleagues before he could finish a sentence, because the image confirmed the story she had already decided to tell about the kind of leader she was going to be. She sat down in the chair across from the sofa and did not move for a moment. Then she leaned forward and touched his shoulder. It took several attempts. Marcus surfaced from sleep in layers, fighting upward through the kind of depth that follows sustained exhaustion. When he finally focused and saw Diane sitting in his living room, his first expression was not anger. It was the specific exhaustion of a person who has just been handed one more thing. "How bad?" he said. "Bad," she said. "The restart executed at noon." He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "How long ago?" "Just over an hour." He reached for the laptop. He scanned the metrics for less than a minute. When he set it down, his face had the particular heaviness of being right about something you had hoped not to be right about. Diane leaned forward. "Before we go anywhere, I need to say something." He waited. "I fired you this morning before you finished a single sentence. I made that decision based on what I thought I saw, not on anything you had the chance to tell me. That was wrong. I am sorry." Marcus looked at her, not with warmth, not with coldness, with the quiet of a man receiving an apology that was accurate and overdue and did not change what the day had cost him. "I'm going back," he said, "because if this breach completes, the businesses and workers whose payments run through that system will pay for mistakes that belong to Vertex. That's the only reason." He stood, not the apology. He changed his shirt, spoke quietly to Theo, asked him 3 questions about dinner, homework, and whether the neighbor had confirmed she was coming. Theo answered each one patiently, in the manner of a child who understands his father is being asked to go back into something difficult and has decided not to make it harder. Before Marcus picked up his laptop, Theo handed him the soccer cleat he'd been holding. "You forgot it last Tuesday," Theo said, "for luck." Marcus looked at him for a moment. He took the cleat and set it on the counter. "I'll be home for dinner," he said. "I know," Theo said. When Marcus walked back into the operations floor, the room changed. Not loudly. It was not applause or relief performed for the gallery. It was the specific quiet shift that occurs when a group of people who have been managing a problem beyond their capacity see the person with the actual capacity walk back through the door. He did not acknowledge it. He went directly to the primary console, sat down, and began assessing. Full log access, current architecture, and someone give me a verbal summary of every intervention attempted since noon. The summary took 4 minutes. Marcus listened without interrupting. When it finished, he was quiet for 8 seconds. Then he started distributing the work. He sent one group to isolate the anomalous outbound connections without blindly cutting them, redirecting them into a controlled observation environment instead. He sent 2 engineers to map exactly where the redirected transaction data was being routed. He asked a 3rd group to construct a controlled failover for the highest value processing queue. He told someone from legal to contact the 3 largest affected clients with scripted language that acknowledged a temporary issue without triggering contractual escalation clauses. He asked one person to do nothing except record every command he issued in sequence. He was not performing mastery. He was executing a plan he had been developing mentally for 3 days, adapting it to a situation that had deteriorated beyond what he had hoped for. He knew the system the way continuous, intimate contact produces. Not just how it was designed to function, but how it had evolved away from the design under years of accumulated patches and emergency fixes, and what that evolution meant when the system was under active attack. Over the following 90 minutes, the bleeding slowed. The anomalous routing pathway was severed from the core payment layer. 3 suspended high-value transactions were isolated and quarantined before any funds cleared to outside accounts. The attack pathway, the specific entry point the intruders had spent a week quietly constructing, was identified and neutralized through 17 targeted changes to the authentication configuration that closed the door and removed the key. When Marcus confirmed that the authentication layer had restabilized and the intrusion pathway was permanently sealed, the room released a collective breath that had been building for 2 hours. Diane, who had stood at the edge of the working area for the entire duration without moving, felt something leave her that had been sitting in her chest since the moment she read the line at the bottom of his repository file. The emergency board review convened that evening. Incident report, full sequence, every decision that had contributed to the outcome laid out in plain language. The room produced the kind of institutional language that organizations generate when they want to distribute responsibility broadly enough that no single failure point becomes too visible. Communication gaps, transition pressures, understandable given the circumstances. Diane recognized the language. She had used it herself in other rooms. She knew its function. She stood. This morning I terminated Marcus Hale before I allowed him to complete a single sentence. I made that decision because the image I saw confirmed the story I had already decided to tell. I was wrong. My decision came close to costing this company something it would not have recovered from. I am saying that plainly in front of everyone in this room. The room was very quiet. Marcus, seated at the far end of the table, gave one small nod. He did not perform forgiveness. He received the apology the way he received most things, without theater, and set it down. What followed in the weeks after that meeting was not a clean restoration. It was something harder and more honest than that. The board offered Marcus an immediate promotion, a significant compensation adjustment, and a newly created role overseeing infrastructure security at a level that matched what his expertise had always warranted. Before he would discuss any of it, he made 3 requests. A revised escalation protocol guaranteeing frontline engineers a direct path to executive leadership on security concerns, a path that could not be blocked by middle management, protecting its own comfort. Mandatory shift rotation standards making it structurally impossible for any single engineer to become a point of failure through exhaustion. And a formal policy protecting any employee who raised a legitimate risk alarm from professional consequences for doing so. The board sat with these requests for a moment. They understood what they were looking at. A man who had been handed significant institutional leverage and had chosen to spend the majority of it protecting the next person in his position from being destroyed the way he had nearly been destroyed. Diane accepted all 3 without modification. The change that mattered most was not in any document. It was in her. The decisiveness did not leave her. The standards did not soften, but something in the way she moved through the building shifted. She began arriving in departments not to inspect, but to ask questions, and she learned to ask the kinds that made people feel safe enough to answer honestly. She learned to recognize the difference between someone who performed competence loudly and someone quietly holding something essential together. It was not a skill she had possessed the morning she walked across the operations floor. It was one she had paid severely to acquire. Several weeks after the incident had formally closed, Diane came through the main lobby in the late afternoon and saw Marcus near the entrance. He was crouched down listening to Theo, who had come to meet him, delivering a fast and animated account of something that had happened at school. His face, which Diane had memorized under pressure as controlled and precise, was entirely different now. Open, present, lit in a way that professional competence does not produce. She stayed back. After a moment, she walked over and crouched beside Theo. "I believe this belongs to you," she said, and held out a small action figure she had found wedged between the seat cushion of her car after the drive back from his apartment. It had apparently fallen from his jacket pocket during the visit. Theo's face rearranged itself into immediate recognition and delight. He took it and examined it with the seriousness of someone recovering something important. Marcus looked at Diane. There was no unresolved weight in the look, but no performed warmth either. It was the look of two people who had come through something difficult from completely different sides and arrived, unexpectedly, at a version of understanding that neither of them had planned for. "Dinner's at 7, Marcus said to Theo. "I know," Theo said. Diane stood. The lobby was ordinary around them, bright and unhurried, people moving through after a regular day. Most noise. They are the quiet ones, running without acknowledgement, holding the weight without announcement. Until someone, finally, pays attention. If this story held you until the end, you already know what to do. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. Tell me the moment that hit hardest. I read every single one. Hale.